Hi, this is Tim Weber from South Texas College coming to you with a little lecture video on the topic of emotions, kind of the standard interpretation and research on that. So we'll move right to our outline. So first of all, let's start out with the definition that you'll find in your textbook about emotions and consider that. So emotions include physiological activation, expressive behaviors, conscious, consciously experienced thoughts and feelings. So first of all, there is some activation of the body, as we'll look at that, things like increases in heart rate and blood pressure. Also, there is expressive behavior. So there is something that indicates the emotion behaviorally, whether that be a facial expression or some other action that the person might take. Thirdly, consciously experience thoughts and feelings. So it's kind of one of those things that is, well, I feel angry or I feel happy or sad. And maybe thoughts about that, cognitions like, oh, that was a really close call, that was awfully scary, or that sure was fun. So these things all then indicate emotions. Now consider that looking at the picture. So we got a little boy here. Um, do you suppose there's anything going on in, well, first of all, is he experiencing an emotion? And I'm sure most of you would look at that and quickly conclude he's angry. Um, Physiological activation, is there anything going on in his body out of the ordinary? Of course there is. His heart is probably racing. He's breathing more heavily. His muscles are tensing up, and many other things that we can measure if we had the right equipment. Secondly, is he expressing his anger in some way, expressive behavior? Yes, you can again see the facial expression. Look at those teeth. Boy, you see somebody showing their teeth like that, you know they're angry. You see him pulling back on that bottle of lotion or whatever it might be. Then, thirdly, the conscious experience of it. If we asked him, do you suppose he could tell us how he's feeling? He said, yeah, I'm mad because he tried to take away my lotion or whatever. So uh, we see all of those just in that simple picture. We also say that emotions are embodied. In other words, they involve bodily responses. So some of those responses will be very noticeable, such as what? Vomiting when severely disgusted. Others might be more difficult to discern, like tiny increases in perspiration when a person is a little bit anxious. Difficult to discern, we might have to use sensitive equipment to detect these changes in the body. So reactions to emotional stimuli then activate the sympathetic nervous system. So, for example, when there is something that we see as a threat, a danger to us, like we're being attacked by a tiger, then the sympathetic nervous system goes into action to create a number of changes in our body that would prepare us for fight or flight, to fight against the threat or to run away. And so notice these will activate the body. So we see that the pupils will dilate so we can see the threat better. We stop salivating because we don't need to digest any food at this moment. We just need to survive. The skin, we begin to perspire. So that way, if the tiger grabs us, maybe we can slip loose more easily and we can run faster for a longer period of time, keep our body cool while we're running away. Respiration increases so we can take in more oxygen to fuel the muscles. The heart accelerates to pump more blood to the muscles. Digestion is inhibited because, well, we don't need to digest anything now. We need to just survive. And a variety of stress hormones are secreted in order to, again, allow us to become more alert and to ramp up the body's response. Now, one thing you should notice is that if we're constantly in a high emotional state, we're going to have constant overstimulation of the sympathetic nervous system. And in the long run, that can wear us out, can cause damage to the body. And so we have to be able to take some time from time to time and get some relief from this sympathetic arousal. By the way, we're not so much geared for modern threats in our emotional and autonomic response. This type of response that we're seeing here was great for our ancestors if they faced a tiger or someone from a neighboring clan trying to steal their child or what have you. Great for a physical response to a physical threat where it's going to be over in just a few moments. Unfortunately, a lot of our modern threats are long term and ongoing. So that rent payment that's due next month that we don't have money for, or how am I going to get that paper done that's due in 3 weeks and it's an ongoing thing. How am I going to get by, although I'm having problems in my family, yet I've got a lot of work to do. And so what we have is a constant extended over arousal of the sympathetic nervous system. Now, when we engage in activities that calm the emotions, then the parasympathetic system kicks in, allowing us to recuperate, recover, replenish our energy. And you can see much of the activity here is sort of a reversal. So this is allowing us to recoup our energy and recover. Once again, it may be advantageous for us nowadays to learn various techniques in order to stimulate the parasympathetic system to calm the emotions, things like meditation or relaxation exercises, walks with nature, things like that. Okay, so let's just take a little side trip into the topic of emotional arousal and performance. Now, when we talk about arousal, what we're talking about is activation of the sympathetic nervous system. So that results in those responses that you see at some level, maybe not 100%, as you'll see. So, milder emotions, we will have a lower level of arousal, okay, or uh, emotionally calm, low level of arousal. Strong emotions result in high levels of arousal and the body being highly activated. So they have learned that optimal performance of tasks relates to the level of arousal that we have. So too much or too little arousal impairs performance on tasks. Now, it depends upon the type of task as to what level of arousal is going to be most effective. So, if we're dealing with a simple, well rehearsed task, something like what? Run as fast as you can for a few seconds, or lift the heaviest possible thing. We're going to do that best at a relatively high level of arousal. Okay. Think, for example, of power lifters who are trying to lift the heaviest possible weight, and they will slap each other around, try to get each other angry so that they can lift more weight. Now, having said that, there is a point at which performance does fall off. Even getting too much emotionally aroused will interfere even with these kind of tasks. Now, on the other hand, if we're trying to do a task that requires fine motor coordination and lots of brain power, then we're going to do that best at a relatively low level of arousal. So things like what? Um, like solving a difficult math problem, lots of brain power, or what? Threading a needle, right? Putting a piece of thread through the eye of a needle, fine motor coordination. We're going to do those best when we're relatively calm emotionally. Or, oh, how about doing brain surgery? Yeah, it requires both coordination and brain power. You don't want that brain surgeon coming in there jumping around and all wild emotionally, right? You're going to say, get me somebody else. I don't want them. Now, notice again that performance at these type of tasks, which they often call difficult tasks, does fall off as arousal increases. But if emotional arousal drops too low again, yes, performance falls off. You get to the point where you're falling asleep and you're not going to do those things well. Now, they found that this relationship is so consistent. It's one of the few things in psychology that we call a law. It's called the Yerkes-Dodson law. So that's fun to know. Oh, by the way, should mention many tasks that we do on a day-to-day basis are neither extremely simple, well rehearsed, nor requiring fire and motor, lots of brain power, but sort of in the middle. Think about what? Maybe driving a vehicle, if you're experienced driver in moderate traffic, that you're going to do best where you're what? Somewhere between the two extremes at moderate levels of arousal. But where it's more of these, you're going to be better at those extreme ends of emotional arousal. So there are numerous theories about how emotions come about and how they evolve. And given the information that we have from neuroscience now, probably the one that comes closest to what actually happens most of the time would be this two-factor theory that was advanced by Schachter and Singer numerous years ago. Now, their theory was that emotions required two factors before the emotion could exist. There had to be some physiological arousal that occurred in the body, and then we had to label that arousal as an indicator of one type of emotion or another. So as you see in the illustration here, you have an emotional stimulus. There's a vehicle coming down the road towards us in a two-lane road where there's nowhere else to go and avoid them, straight at us, head on. And so the response to that emotional stimulus, our heart pounds, there's physical arousal, and we label that as an indication that I'm afraid, this is scary, and therefore we feel fear. Now, something that is consistent with this happens in situations like you see here on the roller coaster. So we have two people who are showing similar physiological responses. Both of them, their heart is racing, they're breathing heavily. You can see even the facial expressions look a lot alike. But if we ask them, they're going to tell us they're experiencing different emotions. Maybe the one on the left says, yeah, my heart is racing because this thing is scary. And the one on the right says, no, no, my heart is racing because, well, it's so much fun. It's so exciting. So similar physiology, but a different label for it, a different emotion being experienced. And this is also consistent with what we see in physiological research on emotions. So when people experience emotions, there are changes in heart rate, respiration, perspiration that are similar across all emotions. However, other patterns may vary. For example, when it comes to blood flow, okay, There are different blood flow patterns with different emotions. So, one of the things that we know is that when blood flows to a part of the body, that part of the body gets warmer. And people sometimes can even physically feel that part of the body being warmer. When it flows away from a part of the body, that area chills and gets cooler. So when people are afraid, uh, they say, oh, it was a chilling experience. In other words, wow, the blood flowed away from their extremities. You know, when people are nervous, that's a type of fear. Sometimes they'll say, yeah, my hands feel cold. I'll hear that before exams sometimes. They'll say, gosh, is it cold in here? My feet feel cold. My hands feel cold. Say, are you a little bit nervous about the exam? Yeah, I am. That's the blood flow pattern, blood flowing away from the extremities when we're afraid. On the other hand, when we're angry, different blood flow pattern. And what part of your body starts to feel hot when you're angry? A lot of people say, well, gosh, my head starts feeling hot. My ears start burning when I'm angry. Blood is flowing away from the other parts of the body towards the head when people are angry. We also have differences in the facial muscles that are activated by various emotions. When people are feeling fear, the facial expression is different than when they're feeling joy. So, not exactly the same from one emotion to the other physiologically, but many similarities. We also have differences in brain activity patterns that have been detected between different emotions. When people are feeling fear or anger, they find areas of the amygdala structure of the brain to be highly active. When people are feeling pleasant emotions, they find more activation of the left hemisphere of the brain, as opposed to when people feel pleasant, unpleasant emotions like sadness or disgust, where you would see more activity now in the right hemisphere of the brain. Now, this interaction between physiological arousal and emotional perception, the labeling of emotions, is also demonstrated in the spillover effect. So, arousal from one event spills over to other events. Um, so, you have, for example, fans at World Cup soccer matches. And fans is short for fanatics. They just go crazy. Uh, the game is so exciting to the fans. So, oddly enough, even if the home team wins, sometimes there's riots in the street afterwards. And you say, why is that? They should be happy that their team won. Well, what happens is that arousal from the excitement of the sporting event is still with people as they leave. And so, as they leave, if they see anyone doing anything destructive at all, they may reinterpret that arousal to feeling angry themselves. They may join in with them. And as more and more people join in on that destructive behavior, you suddenly have a bunch of people overturning cars and lighting things on fire, and you have a riot on your hands. So this also might turn up if you have an argument with somebody. You get really angry, and then you make up with them, and the making up with them seems so much more intense now because you still have some leftover emotional arousal from that argument that you had. Another thing that illustrates that in many cases, the emotion we feel is an interpretation of physiological arousal, is Schachter and Singer's epinephrine experiment. So, what these researchers did, they gathered a group of men who were willing to be given an unnamed drug. They weren't told what it was going to be. And so they injected all the men with epinephrine, which by now you probably know is also known as adrenaline. And so obviously this is going to make your heart race, make you breathe more heavily, and so forth. They then split up the men and put them in one of two different rooms. Half of the men at random were sent to a room where there was a guy who was all grouchy and angry. And the guy was complaining about how the university had screwed him over and ruined his life and so forth. The other room, the other half of the men randomly assigned were encountered a guy in there who was just having fun, joking around, you know, making paper wads to throw at the waste basket. Come on, let's join in, have a fun game here, so forth. So then they interviewed each of the men as they left individually and asked them, well, how did the drug make you feel? Well, what do you suppose the men who were in the room with the grouch, what did they say? Most of them said, yeah, the drug made me feel angry. Gosh, put me in a bad mood. That's a crummy drug. The ones who were in the room with the happy-go-lucky guy having fun, what did they say? Ah, the drug made me feel happy, made me feel good. Gosh, where can I get some of that? Well, it was actually the same drug, but notice there was a different environment that led to different interpretation of that emotional arousal. Another question we might want to answer would be, do we have to be consciously aware of an emotional stimulus to have an emotional response to it? Does conscious awareness of an emotional stimulus always precede the emotional response? It appears not. In experiments, the experimenter subliminally presented either a happy face or an angry face to participants. The either angry or happy face was flashed on a computer screen for a few milliseconds, long enough that it could register at an unconscious level, but not long enough that people knew that they had actually seen anything at the conscious level. They then offered each of the subjects a beverage to drink, and they measured that the subjects who saw a happy face drank more of the beverage than those that had seen an angry face. It seemed that that subliminal angry stimulus sort of shut down their behavior. So it appears we don't have to be consciously aware of that emotional stimulus to have a response. And that may be kind of important to recognize. Sometimes we're responding emotionally to things that we really don't have an awareness of. The dual processing model also helps explain that phenomenon. So our brain processes emotional stimuli in two different ways. We have one route of processing where the information about that emotional stimulus directly reaches the amygdala and similar emotional structures of the brain. So a direct route to these means that this is going to produce a very rapid response. Now, on the other hand, this response, pardon me, this rapid response is rather imprecise, and it tends to err on the side of caution. The second means of processing for emotional stimuli involve our cerebral cortex. Now, the emotional information about that stimulus goes through more steps of processing before it reaches that cerebral cortex. So the result is that um, this response takes longer for it to occur. However, this response is more precise. So notice the response that's occurring here through the amygdala and other emotional structures that is very rapid is also going on at an unconscious level. The response that we're receiving through our cerebral cortex is going on at a more conscious level. So, just what does that mean in everyday terms? Well, here's an example. Okay. Um, this happened to me one time. I used to go out running along the canals, and one day I was out there doing my running, and all of a sudden I took this hop. In a split second, I realized why I had hopped. It was a snake that was in my path that I had jumped over. Now, notice I engaged in that activity of avoiding the snake automatically without my conscious awareness, and it occurred very rapidly. Okay. So, this was this low road response, very rapid, um, very quick, and without conscious awareness. Then a moment later, my cerebral cortex registered that stimulus and said, yeah, that was a good move. Yeah, thank you, unconscious process. It could have been dangerous. Now, notice in some cases, this first response is going to be is going to be appropriate. Other times not. Yeah, maybe you had someone as you're walking down the hall who's hiding in the doorway and jumps out, boo, and they scare you and you haul off and you hit them before you even realize what had happened. Yeah. And notice that you had this imprecise response and not recognizing that that was a friend. You actually went and responded to it before you thought it through, and then this kicked in and you said, oops, I shouldn't have done that. Yeah. um, that said, notice this unconscious rapid response though may be life-saving in some situations. So we do know we can make physical responses to emotional stimuli before we become again consciously aware of them. Now, let's have a look at how emotion is expressed. So the question that I always ask in class when we have a live class is, what are the elements of emotional expression? And they will come up with things like, well, we express our emotions by things we do, giving people hugs, tapping them on the back, maybe punching them in the nose. So yes, many behaviors of that sort, actions. They say, well, what else? Oh, well, how about our facial expressions? Yes. How about our gestures that we make? Yes. How about our tone of voice when we speak? Yes. Um, how about our posture and our body language? Yes, these are all types of emotional expression. Even our breathing patterns express our emotions, sometimes without our awareness. So notice most of the means of emotional expression are nonverbal. It's not the words we say, but the things that we do that give evidence of our emotional state. Now, one of the questions we'll address is this nonverbal language of emotion universal? Is it the same with everybody? Well, just a quick answer to that question might be had by having a look at these two pictures. People from very different cultural groups, and what does the emotion we're seeing look like to you? It looks like in both pictures, the people are happy. You say, well, how do you know that? And of course, the first thing you're going to say is, well, they're all smiling. Smile seems to be a universal indicator of happiness, no matter your cultural background. What else seems to suggest they're happy? You might say, well, what about the closeness of the people in the picture? So, yeah, that's usually something that is part of a happy situation as well. They're expressing that joy of their relationship by being close. Might be another, which again seems to be universal. But we'll look at, are there some cultural differences in emotional expression? One of the things they've noticed that in terms of um, detecting others' emotions, that we have a negative emotional bias. So we're more geared to pick up signals of negative emotions like anger or sadness and so forth. For example, when they subliminally flashed emotion words on a screen, people had a stronger emotional response to negative emotional words than they did to positive emotional words. We seem to have a negative bias. We also detect anger and threatening emotions amongst people more readily. uh, Evidence of that is the pop out phenomenon. So, out of a group of people, if there's someone who's angry, threatening, we tend to focus our attention very quickly on that person as opposed to the other people who are not showing that negative emotional state. Maybe you can think of the picture of that guy in the crowd that we saw when we were looking at memory. And yeah, we're more likely to remember that angry guy out of all the people in the crowd. Again, negative emotional bias. This also shows up in what they found with children who had been victims of abuse. Often they would misinterpret neutral facial expressions as being angry facial expressions. And well, that kind of makes sense. If you've been abused and harmed by others and you're not sure what that facial expression means, maybe you're safer to assume that they're angry and avoid them. So, once again, negative emotional bias. Now, when it comes to detecting emotions, we're very good at detecting uh, real smiles as opposed to fake smiles. And as you can see, Paul Ekman in the picture below, emotion researcher. If you look closely at those and you have good quality video, you would be able to tell that one smile is fake, the other is real. And I said, well, how do you know that one's fake? We just said it just looks fake, but if you think about it more, yeah, a real smile, you see what more turning up of the cheekbones, more crinkling up of the skin around the corners of the eyes, and so forth. In fact, a real smile activates facial muscles that we cannot consciously control. And so the fake smile is simply missing something. Not to mention that fake smiles, people tend to hold them too long and then it just like, come on, I wipe that goofy smile off your face. We know it's fake. Interestingly, when people were judging the emotional state of people as to whether they were angry and were a threat, within a tenth of a second, they could determine whether that person was threatening to them. So we also make these determinations and detecting emotions very rapidly. When it comes to detecting emotions, if we only have facial expressions to work with, even experts are only about 54% good at guessing the emotion other than happiness. Okay, other than happiness. So, not very good, even from experts, if we only have facial expressions to work with. We can be fooled if there's only a facial expression and it's something other than a smile. Now, that said, if we give people more information, if we let the person hear what that individual is saying, see the actions that they're doing, hear their tone of voice, posture, breathing, our accuracy in judging the emotion becomes somewhat better. Now, they've also found that in detecting emotions, some people are better than others. People who are introverts, who are sort of quiet, reserved, shy to themselves, tend to be better emotional detectors than extroverts. Extroverts not so good at detecting other people's emotions, although their emotions are easier to read. Extroverts, the outgoing more social person tends to display their emotions more readily than the introvert. Now, we also should consider emotional communication in electronic media. So, social media like what? Emails, text messages, those sorts of things. What you may have found is there is a lot of room for misunderstanding when it comes to those sorts of communications. Why? Why does that happen? Text message or on a chat, people misunderstand the emotional intent of a message. Well, all they've got to work with are just words typed on a page. Many of the emotional cues are not present. So if we need to communicate something to a person, and it's very important that they understand our emotional intention, what's the best way to communicate with them? Phone call, text message, email? How about in person? If we approach them in person, they can see all of the emotional cues and experience them, and they're much more likely to interpret our emotional intention accurately than if they only have something typed on a page or even only just the sound of our voice. So, communicating in person when emotions are important, that's the way to go. Oh, might mention, oh, yeah, that's right. We do have the emojis now, though, to communicate, right? Yes, but the problem with those are people know those can be faked as well. And so, even there, we're still better to communicate in person if the emotion is important. So, what about sex and emotions? Are there differences between men and women, emotionally speaking? Well, here's what they found. Is women tend to be better at detecting other people's emotions than men are. Now, that's on average. Women also tend to be more aware of their emotional state and express it more readily than men do. So there is a difference there. Although, interestingly, men did have the corner on one emotion. Men were more likely to feel and express anger than women were. Are there cultural similarities in emotional expression? Well, we already determined that a few slides back, but let's have a look at some basic emotional expressions. What they found is when shown people expressing various emotions, even if they're of a very different cultural group, we generally can identify these basic emotions. So this one here, almost everybody say, well, that person looks happy. This one, surprised. This one over here looks what? Frightened. This one, sad. How about this one? If you said angry, you guessed it. And this one, people have a little more trouble here because often we can't think of the word for it. But how about disgust? They look disgusted, like they smelled something bad, right? So yeah, even if it's a very different cultural group, we're generally going to recognize those. Now, whereas there are similarities in facial expressions, there may be cultural differences in how the emotions are expressed. There may be different display rules culturally, cultural customs and norms that regulate how and when people display their emotions. So, one of these is simply, do you display the emotion or not? Cultural differences. So, if you were to walk down the street in a very traditional Chinese village, people of very traditional culture there, you would look at those people and think, those must be the most unemotional people in the world. Well, they're really not unemotional, but in their culture, they don't display their emotions in public. It's considered inappropriate. And of course, encountering us might think, oh, how inappropriate these people expressing their emotions publicly. Another example of this might be if any of you have been to both a traditional Mexican funeral as opposed to I guess you would call it an Anglo funeral. People of European background or European ancestry. Um, so if you've been to both, you'll notice a difference in emotional display. Traditional Mexican funerals, do people display their emotions? Oh, yes, they really do. Um, they express their emotions very, uh, very publicly. In fact, if you don't show emotion at a traditional Mexican funeral, what do they think? They think, oh my gosh, you must not really have cared about that person. Um, so the emotional display is encouraged within that setting. And by the way, particularly amongst women in that setting. On the other hand, Anglo funeral, the display of emotions is discouraged. If someone gets too emotional at one of those kinds of funerals, people will try to calm them down, and will try to get them out of here. Come on, you got to keep a stiff upper lip is one of the expressions they have for that. You can't let your emotions hang out at one of those kind of settings. So there's a cultural difference. Now, I would submit to you that probably people are feeling the emotion in a similar way, but it's not thought of as appropriate to display it. Oh, say, by the way, um, there are differences in cultural uh, expression of gestures. And one of the great examples of this is we had a president a number of years ago went overseas for a conference with leaders of another country. And as he got on Air Force One and went up the stairs there, he turned around and he gave the people there the thumbs up sign. You know, the thumbs up sign, right? And of course, to us as Americans, thumbs up sign means, hey, that was good, that went well, you know, well done, that sort of thing. Well, guess what? It meant something else to the people in that country he was visiting. It was like giving them the finger. Needless to say, he wasn't welcome in that country anymore. So when we're dealing with people of other culture groups, it's important to be aware of that. By the way, I've also had a number of veterans in my classes who've been deployed in the Middle East somewhere. And one of the things that they told me about is when they were there, they were told if you were in a public place, you better not show the bottom of your shoe to people. I said, why is that? Well, because showing people, letting them see the bottom of your shoe was like making rude comments about their mother, and you were likely to cause some trouble, maybe needlessly in that situation. So, knowing about differences, cultural uh, expression, important. Also, emotional expression may have some gender specific norms as well. Think about this. In our cultural setting, what's um, what's an emotion that women can get away with displaying in public that men can't so well? How about mm, expressing sadness? So women can cry in public more readily in our culture than men can. If men do that, we're like, well, what's up with that? But with women, well, we kind of take that as more okay. For that matter, what's an expression that emotional expression that women can't get away with so much in our culture? Um, Being angry. Yeah. When women are seen angry in public, a lot of people will think, they'll start to think of the B word. Um, this is something that probably hurt Hillary Clinton in her presidential campaign. In a few instances, she showed some anger, and many people saw her as being kind of mean spirited, although the male candidates also showed anger, but people were not seeing that to the extent. So, what is thought of as being appropriate varies uh, with the norms of the culture by gender. Now, there are even cultural variations on the smile, as you'll see in the next frame here. So here you have two smiles, American on the left, British on the right. And if you were there, you would definitely know these were smiles. Even looking at the picture, you'd probably say, well, probably smiles in both of them. But notice the British smile to us just looks a little weird, and some people say it looks forced. It looks, kind of put on and so forth. And there's a little bit of difference in how they manipulate their face in their smiles in Britain. Okay. Now, strangely enough, when they look at our smiles, they might say, it looks a little weird to us. But that said, well, maybe not so much because they watch a lot of our American movies. And so they see a lot of Americans and they're probably more used to that. But notice there's still the same basics in the smile, but there are some slight variations. Okay, so in terms of then emotional expression, notice that we can go to the biopsychosocial model. Okay, biopsychosocial, and note that there are biological influences that are part of emotions, physiological arousal, evolutionary adaptiveness. So, what's that? The emotion enabling us to survive, like fear, causing us to avoid dangerous situations, or anger, enabling us to fight for our survival or the survival of our offspring. And then also biologically, different response pathways in the brain. And we ought to indicate also different blood flow patterns with different emotions and so forth. Psychologically, we have the labeling of the physiological arousal, as well as gender differences that influence how we respond to things or display the emotions. Social culturally, we have how expressive is our culture of emotions. Are others present? Oh, we didn't mention that, but yeah, um, think about that one. Well, when my favorite cat died a few years ago, I had to go out to the garage. Why did I have to go out to the garage? Well, because I didn't want the rest of my family to see me cry about the loss of my favorite cat. Yeah, presence of others. I didn't display that emotion in front of them. And then also cultural expectations, as we mentioned just a moment ago. Okay, so now we're going to go into things a bit deeper, and we're going to look at the facial feedback effect. Now we should update that to call it an effect. We'll look at some basic emotions, and we'll spend a little bit more time looking at the emotions of anger and happiness. We'll handle questions like when angry, does catharsis work? We'll look at happiness in terms of the feel good, do goods phenomenon, subjective well being, factors that are associated with happiness, the adaptation level phenomenon, relative deprivation, and ways of increasing happiness. A whole bunch of stuff. So, first of all, the facial feedback effect. This was based on the observation that facial expressions for each basic emotion was similar no matter what culture you were. It seemed to be hardwired into humans. And so, well, if emotions are hardwired to our facial expressions and our emotion changes the facial expression, then we ought to be able to change the emotion, manipulate the emotion by changing the facial expression. So psychologists set out to test this, first of all, asking people about their emotional state and then manipulating their face, like pinning their eyebrows together in a frown here. And once again, asking people to gauge their emotional state. So, did they find that you can take a person who is emotionally neutral and make them feel angry by pinning their eyebrows together like this? Could you change one emotion to another emotion? Say, change sadness to happiness by pinning a smile on somebody's face? And the answer is no, it was not that powerful. That said, what they did find is you could change the intensity of emotion that a person was feeling by manipulating the facial expression. So if a person was already in a bit of a happy mood, you might be able to increase that level of happiness a bit by putting on a more radiant smile. Um, Now, when I first read and heard about this, I thought to myself, well, that's all well and good, but I wonder what would happen if they changed all of the elements of of emotional expression. What if not just changing the facial expression, they also had the person change their tone of voice, their posture, their gestures, their breathing patterns, their actions to be consistent with the emotion that was desired. Well, finally, somebody did the research on that and they found out that was a much more powerful tool. We had a greater potential to change the actual emotion from one to another if we attend to all of these elements of emotional expression. So, this led to what they call the behavioral feedback effect, that when we mimic all elements of emotional expression, uh, to be consistent with the emotion we want to feel, we've got a better chance of experiencing that emotion. So, if we want to be happy, then we're going to want to speak in a happy tone of voice. We're going to want to have upright posture that we would have when we're happy, make large gestures as people do when they're happy, breathe smoothly as people do when they're happy, and do the kind of actions people do when they're happy. And it's quite a bit more likely that happiness will actually follow our behavioral feedback effect. Now, we also know that mimicking the emotional expression of another helps increase empathy. So maybe you've been to a counselor or a therapist, and you might have noticed that they often will mirror your bodily posture and may even mirror the way that you're speaking, the pace and sort of tone of voice that you have. Why do they do that? Well, a couple reasons is that helps them get a better sense of how you're feeling, because the what feedback within their body helps them sense what you're sensing by arranging their body and using it in a similar way. Now, that also helps increase empathy because as they mirror what you're doing to some extent, then you have a sense that they're in tune with you, that they're really hearing you. And so you begin to sense that they are really hearing you. So that's one of the things that you can do even in personal relationships, is mirror the other person's emotional expression to some extent when you want to get a sense of how they're feeling, when you want to establish a rapport, a connection with them. Although I will caution you, don't mirror it perfectly because then it just starts to look weird, right? So, but just somewhat will help you to establish rapport and empathy for others. Okay, now emotional development. Researchers wanted to know, well, just when do different emotions appear and the lifespan? And so what they found is there was evidence for many emotions, even in little babies. As you can see in these pictures here, isn't this fascinating? You can see all these emotions on these babies' faces. Um, which one is your favorite? Which one do you like the best? They're all so cute, right? I don't know about you, but I just get a kick out of B, the anger. And I'm just thinking, gosh, what could a little baby be so angry about? It just, he looks so mad. Anyways, so many emotions, as you see there, already detected very early in life. Other emotions, though, take a little bit longer to develop. Things like contempt, shame, guilt, pride. These are sort of social emotions that require us to have an awareness that other people can be observing our behavior and passing judgment on us. And so these don't come until we have more sense of that others evaluating us. So let's spend some time considering anger. So a couple quotes here from ancient philosophers like Virgil, who said, anger carries the mind away. Yeah, so when you're angry, you don't think as clearly. Probably everybody knows that. Or how about this one by Cato? Um, Anger makes any coward brave. Yeah, so when we're angry, we may have the courage now to do things that otherwise we wouldn't be able to do. Yeah, so anger, you notice, has some beneficial effects in making someone who is frightened braver, but may have some negative effects in terms of our ability to process information effectively and think clearly. So let's look at it a bit more. Now, when we think of anger, this also brings up the question of aggression. And so we usually connect aggressive behavior with anger. And so we might see in defensive aggression, where an animal is preparing for aggressive behavior to defend itself, we will see what the animal will engage in vocalizations, threatening postures, high autonomic nervous system arousal. Take, for example, what a cat that's being threatening. It will hiss. It will arch its back to make itself look bigger. You can see that the thing is, is breathing heavily and so forth. So when we look at this, what effective neural systems are motivating this type of aggression? Well, let's go way back to that part of the chapter where we were looking at those and see if we can find the ones that are involved in this defensive type of aggression. Wow, is that ever back there? I'd have a link to this. Here we go. Okay, so defensive aggression. Okay, which one do you pick? Mm, seems to be primarily, yes, a rage system, okay, as well as potentially that fear system, okay. In some cases, it may also involve the activation of this care system if the defensive aggression is defending one's young as well, okay. Now we also have, let's jump ahead again. We also have a different type of aggression known as predatory aggression. This one, predatory aggression, would be what? Um, a lion stalking its prey, right? About to pounce on that prey. Um, so, predatory aggression, what you see is few vocalizations. Obviously, you don't want to scare away your prey if you're a predator. And you find rather low autonomic nervous system arousal. You'll find heartbeat, breathing slowing temporarily for that. Okay. Um, Threatening postures? No, not in predatory aggression, rather postures that would enable the animal to attack more readily. Not meant to scare off something, but rather to make it possible to attack it. So what effective systems map to this type? Oh, I did put a link in here. I don't know if it worked. No. So I'll jump back to it. Hopefully quicker this time. Okay. All right. So we're going to say, well, what about on this? Well, let's go to this page. So predatory aggression, one would be hunger, right? That system that produces that hunger drive. Okay. Anything on here? We might say that could be involved also with this system that involves power and dominance. So, in fact, if the predatory aggression was designed to raise your rank or your status amongst your group, then that would be the system that might be motivating that kind of behavior. So, what we have is two different kinds of aggression, very different. That's something that's important to be aware of when you're dealing with aggressive behaviors. So, when we're talking about anger, that's primarily going to be involved with defensive aggression. Okay, so as psychologists studied anger, they looked for things that very typically resulted in angry emotions and angry responses, and they found a loss or threat to someone or something that we value. So if someone is going to take away something important to us or threatens to do so, we may get angry in response. A second trigger for angry emotions is power. So we may, again, engage in that predatory aggression in order to move up the dominance ladder. Also, though, if we've found that being angry gives us the power to manipulate other people, then that desire for power might also produce angry emotions. Thirdly, frustration. So we have some goal, and as we attempt to reach that goal, uh, we're not making progress. And so we get angry, we get impatient. Fourth, when we observe wrongdoing or injustice, we may get angry, say it's not fair, it's not right. Now, that's particularly true if we're the ones who've suffered that wrongdoing injustice, we're even more likely to become angry. But sometimes, even if we see that happening to others, we get angry. Then they found all manner of what they called petty irritants tended to trigger anger, especially as they accumulate. So things like foul odors, high temperatures, traffic jams, aches and pains. So take this example, petty irritants building up to anger. You go on a car trip and there's too many people in the car and it's a hot day and the air conditioner has broken down. You're stuck in traffic and you're barely moving and somebody in the car hasn't bathed. Yeah, it's only a matter of time before, yeah, somebody's probably going to fly off the handle. So these can accumulate to trigger anger. Now, there was then a theory that was very popular and still is somewhat popular that if we're angry, we can drain off that angry emotion by acting out the emotion, by venting our anger and acting on it. This is what they call catharsis, venting that anger, acting it out. So, psychologists in modern times wanted to test, does that really work? And as they studied this, they found, well, yes, sometimes venting our anger does work, although it tended to be very temporary, short-lived, and really only worked if we didn't end up feeling guilty or anxious about what we just did or didn't fear retaliation. So it just didn't turn out to be consistently useful in the long term. What they found typically happened much more often when people vented their anger was that it provoked retaliation from others, that it escalated conflicts and magnified anger. So think about this. Suppose I push you. What are you going to do? You push back. You push back just a little harder than I pushed you. So what am I going to do? I'm going to push you back harder. You're going to push me back harder. And pretty soon we're going to be escalating it into a scuffle. So as anger then escalates and anger is magnified, then people get more and more angry. Eventually, it interferes with clear thinking, and we sometimes will end up doing things that we regret because we're now not thinking clearly. And say, what were you thinking when you did that? And you say, well, I wasn't thinking, I was too angry. So it seems that simply venting our anger often not the most effective way to deal with it. We should also recognize that they found that venting our anger can be habit forming. So, yeah, people kind of get a kick in venting that anger, and so they do it more and more. And all of us probably know someone that when you see them coming, everybody says, oh no, here they come. And what are they going to do? They're going to complain about everything. They're going to be all angry, and they're just no fun to be around. Yeah. So, yeah, habit forming, right? So, here are some tips for handling anger from psychological research. First of all, interrupt the angry feelings, interrupt the sequence, delay acting on the angry feelings. Use some distraction to get calmed down. Yeah, they used to tell us, hey, if you're angry, count to 10 before you do anything, right? The counting to 10 is a distraction. By the way, they've done some research on that, and that does seem to have some effectiveness. Although I thought, yeah, counting to 10, maybe for me, it might be more like count to 100 or count to 1,000 to distract yourself because it might take somewhat longer to actually calm down enough to think clearly. Um, Practice competing responses. Okay, so yeah, maybe what you can do something that sort of drains off that angry feeling. You can put that energy into some project that you need to get done, and the feeling of accomplishment competes with anger. Maybe you could what go for a walk instead of punching that person in the face. um, Competing response. By the way, you could promote an emotion that is incompatible with anger. Think about it. What emotions incompatible with anger? Well, how about happiness? It's really difficult to feel angry when we're happy. Or how about compassion? Yeah, when we're feeling compassion for others, it's hard to feel angry about things that they did, right? So if we can activate these other emotions, that competing response, we'll be able to calm down, think more clearly about the situation. Also, learning to be assertive rather than aggressive towards the person we're angry. So when we're engaging in aggressive behavior towards them, what's our intention? What do we want to have happen to them? Aggressive behavior, we want to make them hurt. We want to, yeah, harm them, right? Um, as we saw earlier, that might not be the most beneficial. On the other hand, being assertive is letting that person know your needs in a very firm and upfront sort of way. So Does that mean you need to let the person walk all over you? No. I'll give you one of the techniques that psychologists have discovered that can be useful in expressing yourself assertively rather than aggressively. And it's something called the I message. You say, why do they call it the I message? Because you poke the person in the eye, right? No, no. It's because it starts with the word I, like I, me, you know. So here's how you use that. You start off the sentence with I, and then you fill in the emotion that you're feeling. This can be used for all different, expressing all kinds of different emotions. In this case, we're thinking of anger. So you would say, I'm feeling angry, okay? And say it in such a way that it reflects kind of the intensity of what you're feeling. Let it show in the tone of your voice. And then your sentence continues, your I message continues with the action the other person is doing that is causing you a problem. So maybe I have someone in the house who leaves their dirty dishes in the sink all the time. Okay. So I might say to them, I really feel angry when I see all of those dirty dishes you left in the sink. Okay, so I've named the behavior now. And then that is followed by how that has an effect on you, what effect it's having on you. So, I really feel angry when I find all those dirty dishes that you left in the sink because now I have to wash them before I can have something to eat myself. Okay. So you've let them know how you're feeling, what the problem is, and how it's affecting you. Um, is that person going to automatically change their behavior every time that you present that I message? No, of course not. But having said that, it gives you a much better chance to get their cooperation. They're much more likely to go along with you when you express yourself in that way. If you just attack them aggressively and say, "You're a son of a bitch," you're not so likely to get their cooperation. They're probably just going to push back defensively. iMessage, yeah, they just might hear that, recognize, have a sense of how you're feeling, how you're affected by their behavior, and might actually make that change. And you might be surprised. It happens more than often. You might have to present that iMessage a number of times, though, before it has its effect. So practice that. It's a great way to help people not just understand angry emotions, but other emotions you might be feeling. Okay, also, if we're angry, remember that chronic hostility may be actually hurting us. So, in fact, they have discovered that being angry all the time has negative influence effects on our body in terms of our cardiovascular system, our immune system. It's bad for our health, mentally and physically, to be angry all the time. So we might think that we're making other people suffer by being angry, but in fact, we may be doing more damage to ourselves than to them. Number 6 on our list is to practice forgiveness. Now, this comes out of actual research beyond just, spiritual and religious traditions. Actual research shows that forgiving others can benefit us physically and mentally. So, forgiving the person is what? Giving up our right to make them suffer for what they did, deciding that we're not going to impose those penalties. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that you open yourself up to that person to let them step all over you and run right over you again, but you're not going to hold that against them. So when we release that other person from that guilt, often we're going to also benefit because now we don't have to be angry all the time. So as you look at this, also notice practicing forgiveness might be the hardest thing of all to do on this list. Some of us would say, well, maybe we need some help from beyond ourselves to actually be fully forgiving of others. maybe we have to ask God to help us if we're a religious sort of person. Okay, so when you hear this sort of talk about anger, you might get the sense that, well, I guess psychologists must think anger is bad. Well, is all anger bad? No, not at all. Anger is not always bad. In fact, sometimes it's going to motivate us to protect ourselves, protect others. In this case, anger is serving a useful purpose. Um, when does it become bad? Well, one way you can look at this is anger is sort of like fire. So is fire good? You say, yeah, fire is good. You know, you can use it to cook your food and kill germs and heat your home and all kinds of good things, right? Is fire bad? Well, yes, it can be. When does fire become bad? It becomes bad when it's out of control. And same thing with anger. When it's within our control, it might serve a useful purpose, but if it's out of control, it may actually be very destructive, both to others as well as ourselves. So, so long as we have control of that anger, it might be beneficial. But when we're losing control, we need to find ways to deal with it appropriately. Okay, so now let's shift to the topic of happiness. So, studies of happiness came into vogue in beginning in the 1970s with the initiation of positive psychology uh, and so forth. And so they began studying the correlates of happiness, what things tend to go along with it. And they found out that happiness correlated with lots of desirable things, as we'll see. They found that, for example, people who were happier tended to be more happily married, they tended to earn more. Um, Now, the question is that cause and effect, or is that a correlation? Is that being happier caused the people to be more happily married and earn more? Or is it the fact that they were earning more or more happily married that caused them to be reporting greater levels of happiness? That's the question. Well, this went along with studies of subjective well being, which combined the reported levels of happiness with satisfaction in life that people reported. So we'll be looking at happiness, subjective well being through this section. One of the things they learned is what we now call the feel good, do good phenomenon. And yes, that's an actual psychological term. What they found is when people were happy, they were more likely to help others than when they were not happy. The classic experiments on this, and there's been several of them that have been done, the classic experiment, they would have a person, part of the experiment, would walk down the sidewalk, busy sidewalk, and they would occasionally drop money on the ground, would drop some bills on the ground. The researchers then also had an elderly person stationed at the street corner who appeared to need help crossing the street, and they observed who would help the elderly person. But what they found out is people who happened to discover that money that had been dropped on the ground, temporarily being happier at having found some free money, were more likely to help the elderly lady across the street than if they had not found any money on the sidewalk. So, feeling good, doing good phenomenon. Feel good, do good. Now, other research indicated that this also goes the opposite direction as well. They found that when people engaged in acts of kindness, that they tended to report higher levels of happiness as well. So this is, you might reverse it, the what? Do good, feel good phenomenon. So if you want to boost your happiness, go out and do something that helps somebody. Research about happiness also noted that our positive affects, positive emotions, tended to peak about midway through a day and then taper off as the day wears on. Whereas negative emotions, negative affect tended to remain pretty steady throughout the day with maybe some increase towards bedtime, towards the evening, the end of the day. So, given this typical pattern of emotional ups and downs, um, should you have that sensitive discussion with somebody at the end of the day? This would suggest that your odds of a positive response probably better if we have that conversation somewhere midday with them. If we wait till the end of the day, we may find that their emotional state already not as positive, and negative emotions being somewhat more prominent, they might not take as well to that sensitive discussion towards the end of the day. Maybe midday's better. Now, what they also found is that if we'd had a bad day, we tended to rebound from that bad day with a somewhat better day. So emotions, they found, tended to balance themselves out to a great extent. And so what they learned is we tend to overestimate the duration of our emotional state, how long we're going to be in that emotional state, and we tend to underestimate our capacity to adapt emotionally. So as we look at things that illustrate this, you might have said to yourself, if I end up with some significant disability, or if I get diagnosed with some serious illness, I'm going to go in a depression and I'm going to just stay that way. Or maybe that happens and you feel like, oh, it's going to stay like that. I'm going to be down in the dumps forever. But what they found is, studying people whom this actually happened to, that people over time recovered their emotional balance and they tended to return to the levels of happiness that were reported before that disability or serious illness occurred. So, we tend to overestimate that we're going to stay in that down emotion. Uh, we're likely to regain our emotional balance after a time. Or maybe you've said to yourself, well, gosh, if I ever ended up completely paralyzed, I don't think I'd want to live. But when they studied people who actually experienced this, they found that these people were rarely suicidal. They, again, regained their emotional balance to a great extent. Now, there's always the exceptions, but we should really have more confidence in our ability to handle um, difficulties and adversity emotionally. We probably have more there than we thought. So, what's the connection between wealth, well being, and happiness? Will more money make you happier? And you say, well, yeah, I think so. What about winning the lottery? And of course, you say, well, who wouldn't be happier if they won the lottery? Well, here's what they found out about wealth and well being. Number one, they found that people who were struggling for just basic needs in life, people that they didn't know where their next meal was coming from, they were struggling just to get some water to drink, roof over their head. It is true that people at this level of dire poverty did report being very happy somewhat less often. Okay. So struggling for the very survival basics does seem to have a slightly negative impact on happiness. On the other hand, if people's basic needs are satisfied, here, even if people are poor, they report almost the same levels of happiness as those who are wealthy and rich. So once you have the basics, it seems that having more doesn't really increase levels of happiness to any great extent. And this also showed up. People in wealthier countries report being only a tiny bit happier than people in poor countries. It doesn't really seem to increase your happiness if you're wealthier to any great extent. Now, what they also found is when you have a sudden improvement in your financial condition, you also may experience a temporary boost to your happiness. So you win the lottery, and yeah, your happiness is going to take a jump for a bit, but over time, it will tend to what again gravitate back down to what your typical levels of happiness have been in the past, even if you don't lose the money like a lot of people do. So we tend to gravitate towards a certain level of happiness. Here's an illustration that helps answer the question, does money buy us happiness? So what they have learned, this chart is really a bit mislabeled. This is really not actually personal income per se, but it's rather person's buying power is what it really amounts to. And notice that the average person's buying power, stuff that we're able to buy, has tripled on average since 1957. So since the year I was born, people can now afford to buy about 3 times as much stuff as they used to. Wow, that's great. But notice levels of happiness that are being reported, reporting being very happy, really haven't changed much. So simply increasing the amount of stuff that we can buy didn't result in people reporting being very happy to any great extent more than before. Here's some research on values and life satisfaction connected to our happiness. So, in researchers by Casser, they found people who valued close relationships, personal growth, and helping others tend to experience higher satisfaction in life than those who valued other things highly. So, our relationships with others, developing our potential, and pro social behavior, helping others, boosted life satisfaction. On the other hand, studies by Ryan found that those who were striving hardest for wealth and had that most of all as their goal tended to report lower sense of well-being than those who had other goals. So the more you make wealth your goal, it seems the lower your sense of well-being. And in the diagram here, you have results of a study where students were asked whether to what extent did they value money, to what extent did they value love, and notice the higher they reported their value for love, the greater their satisfaction in life they reported. It seemed to enrich their life in valuing love. On the other hand, those who reported money as being highly valuable to them, a high value for them, tended to report lower satisfaction in life the more they found that to be a high value. So it seems that if you're placing your value in life on money, you're probably not going to be all that satisfied. And I think part of it has to do with, well, when's enough, but we'll get to that. Okay, so let's have a look at what they call the adaptation level phenomenon. And this is a psychological phenomenon that we adjust our baseline level for anything based on our recent past experience. So what is kind of the neutral level is adjusted based on what we've recently been experiencing. Give you an example of this. I lived in California for about 3 years. And when I first moved to California from Texas, I lived right along the coast there in California, and the weather was so nice. and weather rarely got more than the mid 70s. And if it got up above 80, people who had been living there for some time would be just complaining and all unhappy. And oh my gosh, it's so hot, just 80 or above. And I thought, that's so crazy. You know, but guess what? After I had lived there for a little while, guess what? I was also complaining when it got up above 80. I had readjusted what was, too hot based on my more recent experience. That baseline level had been changed by that recent experience. So this also happens when people win the lottery. And so temporarily they're very happy. But what happens? They get used to having that level of money, and even if they don't lose it, well, they gravitate towards the same level of happiness they had before. Now, if they lose some of the money, it's that much worse because now they've gotten used to that level of wealth, having spent it, now they don't have that money. Now they're not so happy. Or here's another example of this adaptation level phenomenon. So you're going along and your employer gives you a pay raise and you're happy. You say, this is great. And so you're happy for a while though. But after a while, the happiness about that level of pay begins to fade. And after a while, you're saying, you know what, I really ought to be paid more. And you're not happy now with that level of pay anymore. You've gotten used to it, you might say. So this is where happiness kind of becomes a moving target. And the more we gain in wealth and so on, we get that temporary boost of happiness, and eventually, though, we end up being dissatisfied with it. So this also might bring up what they found in other research, that people seem to have sort of a happiness set point. Just like we all have sort of a body weight that we tend to gravitate towards if we don't pay any attention to it, it seems people gravitate towards a certain level of happiness. They actually have determined that this is genetically influenced. Maybe half of the variation in typical levels of happiness from one person to another simply seem to be genetic. And that's kind of interesting. You look at some families, and some families, they just seem to be kind of happy, and other families just all seem to be kind of unhappy, and doesn't necessarily seem to have any attachment to their situation in life. It just seems to be the way they are as people. So that's again something we need to remember, is we're going to tend to gravitate towards a certain level of happiness to some extent. So adaptation level phenomenon. Another phenomenon would be that of relative deprivation influencing levels of happiness. So relative deprivation is the perception that others are better off than we are. So we look at them and we say, oh, we're deprived relative to them. We're comparing ourselves with our peers, others that we see to be likely similar to ourselves. So happiness can be influenced also by our comparisons with others. Here's a classic example. So you had to take a very difficult test and you got a B on that test. You studied hard, and so you're thrilled you got a B because you thought, I could fail that test. Well, you're happy with your B until you find out, anybody want to guess? Till you find out everybody else in the class got an A. You're the only one that got a B. All of a sudden now, you're not happy with that B anymore. Yeah, now it's the same grade, but what? You're comparing yourselves with others, feeling deprived. And so now, yeah, you don't value that. You're not so happy. Now, this also occurs when we make other comparisons, like we have certain expectations for ourselves, but our expectations are not consistent with our attainment. We expected to do better at something, and we didn't. So this comes into play. Um, let's say that you're deciding what classes to sign up, and your advisor says, "Hey, why don't you take that psychology class? You know, psychology's easy." And you say, "Yeah, sounds good." And then you get into the class and you find out that's not easy. Hell, you got to study. Uh, Notice you'll be less happy about your situation having gone in there thinking it was easy and finding it's not what you expected. You'll be less happy than if they told you, take that psychology class. It'll be challenging, but you can get through it. You're going to have to study. You're going to be more happy now if what you encounter is consistent with what you expected. So this sort of comparison phenomenon affecting our happiness comes up in other ways besides this relative deprivation. Okay, so what can psychologists suggest for how we might feel happier? Okay, one of the things they found is, yeah, counting our blessings increases happiness. So focusing on what we have uh, as opposed to what we don't have. So, for example, psychologists found that people who were somewhat depressed, when they read about how hard life used to be, well, they felt better about their lives now. They felt a little happier when they compared how difficult things used to be to how they are now. In other studies, they found that mildly depressed people felt somewhat better when they read about the severely depressed. Yeah, so it's like they say, there's always something worse. It's pretty much almost true, you know. And so if you think about how much worse things could be and what you have rather than what you don't have, you will tend to feel happier. And this is also encapsulated in this proverb. I'm not sure where it came from. I said, I cried because I had no shoes till I met a man who had no feet. Yeah, all of a sudden, not having shoes seems a lot less depressing than having no feet. So, yes, comparing, looking at what we have as opposed to what we don't have. Now, in studies of happiness, they also looked at things that predicted happiness, that statistically corresponded with it, correlated with it. And so here's a few of the things they found. They found that people who were happier tended to also have higher levels of self esteem. They tended to be more optimistic, outgoing, agreeable. So your attitude towards things, taking a positive view, as well as your relationships with others, seem to be beneficial. Close friendships correlated with happiness, as did a satisfying marriage. So working on our relationships with others. Also, they found people who were happier had work and leisure that engages their skills. So, something that is challenging yet doable tends to keep us happier than having nothing to do or having things to do that lack challenge. Also, they found people who had a meaningful religious faith, at least that was meaningful to them, tended to be happier than those that lacked any religious faith. And people who slept well and got some exercise tended to be happier as well. So those physical things might contribute to our happiness. Now, on the other hand, a whole bunch of stuff that you maybe might think was related to happiness didn't really uh, connect to it statistically. Like age, for example. They found that age was not a good predictor of happiness. And interestingly enough, even the elderly reported levels of happiness that were pretty consistent with what they had when they were younger, unless they were suffering from some severe disability. Um, Gender, okay, didn't generally correlate with happiness. Now, they did find more emotional extremes with women. Women tended to experience depression more often, but they also experience joy more often. So just more on the extreme ends. Educational level didn't correlate with happiness. So maybe you've said to yourself, well, if I just get that college degree, I'm going to be happier than I was before. Well, the research says, well, maybe not. That said, the education might benefit you, but don't expect getting that diploma to just make you endlessly happy for the rest of your life. Maybe it's what you do with it later. Parenthood. So, whether one has a child or not didn't correlate directly with happiness, or physical attractiveness also did not correlate. Now, that's interesting. You know, how many times have people said to themselves, oh, if I was just better looking, I'd be happier? Well, the research actually says, nah, you probably wouldn't. So, make yourself look better if you like, and there might be some benefits, but don't assume that you're just going to feel happier because you're better looking. So that makes me feel good. When I look at myself in the mirror, I may not be so attractive, but it's not going to make me happy necessarily. Okay, so just rounding it out with a few other ideas on increasing happiness, again, based on actual psychological research. Realize that money isn't everything. Utilize your time to be active, engage in things that you're passionate about, develop your skills, develop your abilities, help others. Playing the part of being happy can also increase our sense of happiness. Remember the behavioral feedback phenomenon, the feel good, do good, or do good, feel good effect. Getting some exercise also boosts happiness, releases neurotransmitters and hormones that help us to feel good. Getting our happiness sleep, trying to get a good night's sleep as much as we can. Nurturing at least one close relationship with others, doing good for others, do good, feel good. And then expressing gratitude. I didn't really tackle that one. Let me just take a little side trip there. This is one that was studied first by Marty Seligman, as once the president of the American Psychological Association and leader in the positive psychology movement. At any rate, what Seligman did is he gathered a group of students who volunteered for an experiment. And the experiment involved, first of all, the student was to write a letter of gratitude to someone who they felt had really had a positive influence on them. And then they were required to go and personally, face to face, read that letter of gratitude to that person and give that to them. They measured the levels of happiness of the volunteers before the gratitude visit and afterwards, and found that higher levels of happiness were reported post the gratitude visit. It gave a boost to happiness. They also found an unexpected result. They found that frequently the person who received the gratitude visit, received the letter, turned around and they did this for someone else. So it turned out to is also a way to spread ripples of happiness throughout relationships. Um, so that's one you can try if you want to be happier. Express your gratitude to someone. He also tried another experiment that he called the three blessings. And volunteers in this experiment, all they had to do was at the end of each day, sit down and write down three good things that happened. They called them blessings, but it could be what? Just even little things, I crossed the street without getting run over, but whatever it is, three things a day. Again, they measured levels of happiness before the students started this exercise, and then after they had done it for a couple of weeks, once again, the students reported higher levels of happiness having done that exercise. So when I read about that experiment, I thought, I'm going to try that myself. And so I set out to do this, but I'm not very consistent. And so some days I would write them down and some days I didn't. What I did notice, though, And I think this is one of the reasons that this seems to boost happiness is on the days after I had written these things down, I tended to notice even little things that were good and pleasant more readily if I had done this the day before. I think it helps us get into tune with all of the blessings that we do have in our environment. So this is one you can try if you want to feel more happy. Okay. And then finally, nurturing the spiritual. So uh, looking at the bigger picture of what's beyond just what we can see here, whether that is through traditional religious faith or some other practice, they found people reported higher levels of happiness. We might mention, in terms of spiritual practices that have been studied by psychologists, they have studied numerous types of meditation and found that people who meditated regularly over a period of months, they also reported higher levels of happiness as well. So this seems to be beneficial, spending some time in meditation and similar practices, whether those are religious practices like contemplative prayer, Christian tradition, or other types of meditation that might be part of other religious traditions, or just meditation not connected with any religious faith seem to have some benefits. Okay, now just a little side trip that I want to include here for you in terms of cognition and its interaction with motivation and emotion. So, thinking, cognition, involves different areas of the brain than emotions and motivation. So, our cognitive processes in interpreting information, thinking, making decisions, primarily coming out of our cerebral cortex, that outer layer of the brain, and particularly that frontal cortex, prefrontal cortex. On the other hand, our motivations and emotions are primarily driven by actions of deeper brain structures, midbrain and lower brain structures. We'll just call them deep brain structures, DBS for short, and cerebral cortex, well, CC for cerebral cortex. So notice that these areas of our brain function differently. Those deep brain structures that are involved with motivation and emotions tend to operate automatically and tend to operate at a sort of unconscious level, whereas we're more conscious of the workings of our cerebral cortex, and we also um, have maybe somewhat more control of that. So, what we have then is that inputs from our sensory systems, that is, our eyes, ears, sense of touch, smell, so on, from our motor systems, movement, and those types of signals from our body, and regulatory systems, the systems that regulate our blood, blood pressure, heart rate, and so on. The inputs from all of these often connect directly to those deep brain structures that have to do with motivation and emotions, but only connect indirectly through other brain structures to that cerebral cortex. So, what's that mean? Changes in sensory motor input and the regulation of our body systems can have a more direct effect on our motivation and emotions than the action of our cerebral cortex. Cerebral cortex responding to this information coming in indirectly. So that information also likely reaching our cerebral cortex somewhat later than it's reaching those motivational and emotional systems deeper in our brain. The outputs to our motor systems that result in actions and regulatory systems that influence our bodily functioning Often these outputs are, again, direct from those deeper brain structures that are involved in motivation and emotion. But the cerebral cortex often transmits these messages through those deeper brain structures as it passes through it, maybe somewhat filters the responses of our cerebral cortex. So we also then can look at this as indicating that one, our motivational and emotional responses are going to be more directly influenced by sensory information, motor feedback, and what's going on in the autonomic nervous system of our body. Motivation and emotion tend to be more directly influenced by that than our thinking. Our thinking, cognition, more likely to be somewhat indirectly influenced. Also, our actions regarding motivation, emotion, that those deeper brain structures that operate on an unconscious and automatic level have more direct control over our actions and our regulatory systems of our body than do our conscious thought processes. Our conscious thought processes less direct. We can also look at the connection between thinking and motivation and emotion in terms of how these two systems influence each other. Okay, so our cerebral cortex connects with those deeper brain structures involved in motivation and emotions. So, can our thinking have an influence on motivation and emotion by influencing these structures? Yes. Although, when we look at the opposite, what about the connections running from those deeper brain structures involved with motivation and emotions running to our cerebral cortex? Here we have far more connections, far thicker connections from those deeper brain structures to influence the cerebral cortex. So, what this sort of suggests is that those deep brain structures producing motivation and emotion have the upper hand in influencing our thinking. Our thinking, though, cerebral cortex, less able to fully influence our motivation and emotional structures. Okay. So, this is why motivation and emotion tends to impact our cognition, how we think of things, think about things, more than how our thinking influences our motivation and emotion. We're going to have a much harder time influencing our motivation and emotions through thinking than our emotions influencing how we think. Um, so some people have kind of compared our cerebral cortex as being sort of like a rider, um, a person riding an elephant. The cerebral cortex, that person, uh, the deeper brain structures being that elephant, that person may try to control that elephant, but to what extent do they really have control? They may exercise some control, but if the elephant really wants to do something, they might have a hard time restraining it. And that's kind of what we're seeing here. Relationships between thinking, motivation, and emotion tends to be these motivation, emotion has a stronger influence in cognition. So, what's that mean? Okay. If we want to change our behavior, okay, if we can tap into directly motivation and emotion, we're going to be more able to change that behavior. We're going to do it more readily than if we just try to change that behavior by changing how we're thinking. Okay, so that's one thing. Um, implications. Oh, does changing how you think, does it help with changing the behavior? Yeah, it could be helpful. But if we want to really tap into the most powerful influence, we're going to change that emotional and motivational response. And often the thinking will follow it, actually. Okay. Now, implications for therapy. Okay. So let's say we have a person that has a phobia of something. Well, we had something that's, well, it was real popular and still is pretty popular, called cognitive therapy. And so cognitive therapy, uh, they tried to help people identify maladaptive thinking patterns and change those thinking patterns. And it was the goal then to change motivations and emotions. Well, it was thought of as being a pretty good therapy at the time, but really didn't work all that well across the board if you looked at, percentages. And why didn't it work? Well, what we have right here, our ability to change the functioning of our motivation and emotions by just thinking differently is somewhat limited, whereas the emotional and motivational structures much more influential on our thinking. So if we want to again change the behavior, change the emotional state of the person, if we can tap into motivation and emotions uh, first and foremost more directly, we're going to be more effective than if we just concentrate on how people think. Well, that's enough for now without going in deeper with it. And that's plenty on this topic. So we're going to call it quits here and post the video for you. Thank you for listening.